Positioning yourself for board service is all about self-discovery. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future ready. In this episode, Lisa Shallett, co-founder of Extraordinary Women on Boards, and Susan Paley, NACD Vice President of the Chapter Network, discuss how anyone can start on their path toward board service through networking, continuous learning, and the process of self-discovery. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Lisa Shallett, thank you so much for being here with us today. I want to jump into the topic of positioning yourself for board service. We've done a number of these podcasts about different aspects of board service, and something that our members, whether they're currently directors or not yet directors, are constantly interested in is this topic. So you're someone who served on boards, you've brought people onto your boards, and you've helped a number of individuals land a board seat. What does somebody thinking about future board service need to know? Where do they even start? What's that first step?
Thank you so much for having me. And this is a great question. And this is a simple answer. Learn what a board does. Sometimes I've encountered people who are very interested in board service, but haven't taken the time to really understand how a board works. And certainly for public company boards, that's easy to learn. Understand what committees there are, understand what those committees do, understand what the purpose of the board is. And there are some excellent books. You know, NACD certainly has excellent resources, but Dambisa Moyo has a really good book. There's plenty of content that a lot of the auditing firms put out, particularly at the beginning of a year, where it highlights the key risks that boards face. And there are a number of organizations and programs that can help people prepare, but not to prepare is really not a good way to start.
Well, usually this group of individuals are the types who love preparing, right? Who want to do all the work. So if they're busy making sure that they immerse themselves in how a board works, to your point, and reading the good books and the educational events that are offered, what do they have to have on their resume? I mean, when it comes down to preparing for board service, what should I be thinking about in terms of the roles I say yes to, the experiences, and the skills that I'm collecting?
You know, I don't think that any particular role or skills or experience, will be so defining as this makes you perfect for a board versus that, because there are so many reasons why domain expertise and leadership experience, however the context might evolve, can be very important and relevant. But what I'd say is that during your career, especially when you're in a company that has colleagues who might be focused on risk, or colleagues who might be, in legal, or folks who deal with crisis, or people who are, in a board secretarial or governance kinds of roles, having the opportunity in your organization to network and get to know those people. Because, in your business settings, you might not necessarily interact with those kinds of folks in control functions, et cetera. And talking with those folks about the types of ways they look at risk, the types of ways that they think about oversight, the ways in which they interact with the board or board directors and what they might focus on. I think that those kinds of internal networking that you can do are ways that many people don't think about in order to just get additional perspectives that, a traditional business role might not have unless you happen to be in one of those functions. So that's something that I like to tell people to do. Other than that, I think that pretty much any leadership role where there is oversight, sometimes that might be, having responsibility for a P&L. Sometimes that might be overseeing, a very important process, whether that's compliance, whether that's legal, whether that's operational, can be any kind of thing where, you just need to think about the implications and risks from a governance perspective. I think that those things are helpful.
So right now, you've mentioned understanding how a board works, experience in true leadership, really having the chops in terms of P&L and other experience. And I like this discussion point that you brought up, which was, I think you called it internal networking, that there's this three-dimensional version of networking we can do inside our own roles and organizations. Yeah?
Yes, exactly.
And what about not just having those kind of back channel conversations, but how important is it to have experience presenting to the board in your executive role?
Well, I mean, for sure, any kind of direct experience with the board of the company that you might be in, or any of its committees, or even just having conversations around things that become boardroom agenda topics. So right now, talent is a huge topic. AI is a huge topic. How is the company that you're in thinking about those things and presenting to the board on those things? So I think that, those types of opportunities are really helpful. And especially when you are trying to get ready for your first board position. And often that's a big milestone or hurdle. One of the most frustrating dilemmas people face is that, you can't get on a board until you've been on a board. So how do you try to overcome that? Is by having as many touch points that are either directly in contact with boards by presenting, et cetera, like you mentioned, or enough of here's, this piece of the elephant, that piece of the elephant that can give you a sense as to all the different things that boards do and the touch points that they have.
Right. If you want to devour an elephant, you have to go bite by bite. So you brought up touch points and points of contact. This idea of networking, for some, it's a joy to hear that word. For others, it sets them on edge and makes their knuckles white. What would you recommend around some real helpful hints for networking? You mentioned inside and also externally.
I think networking gets a really bad name when there are so many ways one can learn information and make relationships that they don't know might be incredibly helpful to their getting on a board later. So what I usually like to do is tell people to think about networking as always being someone who can bring something to the table. If you start getting into the mindset of it being one way and you're a taker, that sometimes will make it uncomfortable for people. But I think people should feel confident that no matter what they're doing, they have expertise that would be valuable for someone else to hear. These days, the world is moving so fast that whatever you're doing, you probably have a really good sense as to what is a new trend or what's important or what are people focused on that, the world's moving so fast, people don't have enough time to notice it themselves, or it's a perspective that they don't have. So hopefully that brings down some of the barriers of networking, which is to really feel confident that it's a conversation you're contributing to, not one where, it's you're asking for something that in a way that is taking. But I would say that pretty much any opportunity to talk about topics related to risk, and, sometimes having been on the control side of the house, so to speak, when I was in compliance, legal, and audit related functions, not everybody is reaching out to them proactively to ask them about the things that they know best, which is what could go wrong? How do you think about managing risk and things like that? So sometimes those conversations might be very welcomed. Often those folks find themselves in conversations about when things are going wrong. So you might find that people are very receptive. It's great to talk to people who are on boards and can be great, mentors or peers who can help share their experiences. And, I just find that with networking, if you bring a lot of energy and enthusiasm and intel to the conversation, it becomes fun, not a chore. So part of it's mindset.
Yeah. I love that word energy that you used. You bring energy, you bring intelligence. Yeah, you're having a conversation. That's what networking boils down to. And what a great idea. I haven't heard this before. There's an auditor sitting behind closed doors with a stressful problem. You just want to call and not discuss that. You want to discuss how they do their job, get some inside skinny. What a great idea.
Yeah, take them out to lunch.
You discussed this idea of bringing something to the conversation, certainly not making it one-sided, which I'm sure is like a rule for life in general, right? In terms of what we bring to that conversation, it can be non-specific. It can just be, as you say, your intelligence and your energy and have confidence you have something to offer. At the same time, we often hear this concept of like, what's your sort of selling point, as if we are a product. What say you to that concept? And if you do buy into it, do you have any suggestions of like a formula someone would go through to figure out what their unique value prop is?
I would say, what do you find most interesting right now about your job? Or what are you seeing that seems to be a new trend? Or where are you spending most of your time and why? That usually gives me, if I'm the other side of that conversation, a chance to kind of see what someone is either passionate about or expert in or both. I think in addition, noticing about yourself, what do people come to me for? Everybody has things that they're considered a go-to for, or everyone thinks about those in their network or their friends about what would you go to that person for. And sometimes that's a skill like, oh, well, that's my friend who knows all the good restaurants all the time, or who knows all the Broadway shows, or whatever it might be. Or this is my friend that I go to whenever I have a question about, AI or whatever that might be. What do people go to you for? And is that the type of thing that you think they should be going to you for? I have a great friend named Sen-Yin Chang, who is at Duke University and focuses on people's superpowers. And sometimes people can't even see their own superpowers because it's the thing that they're most naturally good at that they don't realize that it's a superpower, that it's hard for other people. So one of the best ways to get some feedback on discovering what your superpowers are is to ask others around you. What do you think I'm really good at? And then, try to have a sense of where you feel like you're most in the flow, or what your zone is, or what topics you find yourself gravitating to. I wish that there were a way to like do a word cloud of the articles that I, read on my phone and save for later, because I'm sure that I would learn something from that data about what I'm most interested in. What am I gravitating to? So I think part of it is kind of being a bit of an investigator of oneself, and then asking others who see different sides of you or who interact with you what they think, and then, just reflecting on what it is that people think you're good at and ask you about all the time.
I have to say, I think we'd have quite the book club if we took all the books that are saved on my iPhone browser and your iPhone browser, go for years on that. Because I just keep thinking of, oh, I should read that. I love it.
And the question is whether you get to read it or not. Why do you love it? Because that will tell you something about at least what you're drawn to.
Yeah, I love this topic you've hit upon, which is sort of becoming a world-class detective about your interior space, right? About, when you said you should ask yourself, where do you spend most of your time? I thought the follow-up question could be, and does that energize you, or does it make you feel kind of dead inside? Because that's some good information.
Love that addition. That is a great nuance you've added there.
And I think you've also hit on something where you talk about it's not just a solo job of figuring out what I love and why. Asking people, they're some of our best data sources, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, before we get more into the nitty gritty of the how and this flow of positioning for a board seat. Let's back it up just a notch. And I want to ask a question about what happens before you're lunging for it and going for it down that path. How do you know if board service is right for you and if you're ready to start that journey?
That is a hard question. Let me think about that. I think that sometimes you can tell that as to how you feel in meetings, because boards ultimately spend a lot of time meeting. And I think for public board service, one of the most important things is to know the difference between what is oversight and what is management's role. And, if you're coming from having managed things and led things, odds are you're going to be very well versed in the management part. And it's going to be really hard to imagine what it's like to have a view or know something or even have done something and see the way management is handling it and, try not to overstep. You can suggest, but you might not overstep. That is called, noses in, fingers out, I believe. And so imagine situations where you are in that kind of role, where your fingers are out. In the context of boards, a type of situation where your fingers might be in is with private company boards, where they tend to want to use your domain expertise, your connections, any kind of skill that can help them. So in some ways, board service has several different kinds of boards that you might consider before you either say I'm in or rule it out. And for some people, private boards might be perfect. And for some people, public boards, more governance focused, more predictable, might be more appropriate. And, if you find that you imagine that role to be very boring, I mean, let's not glamorize board work. There's a lot of reading that you need to do. There is a lot of sitting in meetings that you need to do. You have a tremendous opportunity to be thoughtful, to have influence, and hopefully to add value. But that might not be the way everybody rolls.
So if I don't love a lot of reading and I don't really enjoy sitting in meetings, I might not be inclined toward board service. What else would be a sign that I'm not quite cut out and that I should take a different path?
I'm trying to think of a good answer to that. And I think the reason that I am hesitating to give you a definitive answer is because I think very expansively and inclusively about the type of person who is ready to be in a boardroom. And I think that, anyone that you're talking about would already know some of the basic things, right? Leadership skills, how to behave kind of as part of a team and as a team player, and how to be very collegial and respect other people's answers, but not be afraid, if that's the right word to use, to make a point, even if it might not be a popular one. That's something that you have to do. And if that isn't the kind of role that you want to play, if you're the type of person who, tends to prefer to be kind of in the background or quiet in the room, then maybe board work isn't the right role for you.
That point about what I would say is professional courage is an important one. Yeah.
Right. And I just want to make an important distinction. Like, I'm not saying that if you're an introvert, you don't belong on a board, because that's obviously not the case. But it's, how are you, is this an activity that seems intellectually interesting and, something that you would want to spend your time on? Because it's not an insignificant amount of time.
I think that one thing that I heard you say that was interesting to me, because I hadn't heard it framed quite this way, is that what we abbreviate as NIFO, noses in, fingers out, is for sure historically the approach for you distinguished for public company boards, where you are definitely in an oversight governance position, and maybe a little more fingers in is warranted for private company boards. Really interesting, because we know that the number of publicly traded companies has decreased in recent years or decades. There are, I would say sometimes it feels like countless types of private companies and private company boards seeking people to bring their expertise, their wisdom in a more hands-on capacity. And I hadn't quite thought through it with that lens, but there are so many opportunities then to explore for candidates.
Exactly. Definitely. And I think sometimes people get caught up in the view that, public boards are more prestigious. And I think that, depending on who you are and what you're interested in and the expertise that you have, it might be worth considering one over the other, or maybe both interest you. I've seen plenty of people put together kind of portfolios of board service that include both, and they all serve different, needs and ways of learning and ways of contributing.
So when we talk about any of these types of boards, how does a person begin to explore, okay, what kinds of boards are there? What the opportunities might be? What may be suitable for them? Is there any rhyme or reason to how we go about that discovery?
I mean, honestly, I think probably the easiest way to do that these days, hallucinations notwithstanding, is, to have a conversation with ChatGPT about it. I've learned a lot just from, brainstorming as to, okay, what are the top 10 risks that board directors of public company boards need to focus on right now? And then it'll give me, 10, and then I might dig into one and then get 10 related to that one. I mean, there's so much that can come to you so quickly by using that method. And everything that I've encountered seemed pretty accurate. So I would recommend that as the most, probably efficient way to get your head around, this whole space and the various types of boards. And you could even ask questions like, how does a family-owned private company board differ from, a Series A VC-backed portfolio company board? And you'll learn some things from doing that. I think that's like the best tool we've got right now.
That's great, Lisa. Instead of talking about how we need to talk about AI, you just recommended that our candidates use AI for the search. What a change from if I, interviewed you 5 years ago or even a year and a half ago.
Right.
If I flip that question around, how do you think, and has it been the case that boards have changed how they're looking for candidates in the past few years? What have you observed?
I think that there are always there's been let me say it this way, there's been a debate that's been ongoing, and I don't see it changing, between having a generalist, who brings some obvious skills to a board that a board would need, and having a specialist, who might be an expert in cyber or an expert in AI or an expert in you name it. And I think that, sometimes depending on the nature of the company and the issues that that company faces, it might be helpful to have, a cyber expert. But, probably 2 years ago, we would have been talking about an ESG expert. I've seen some focus justifiably on having, CHROs in the boardroom. There's so much that is a big focus on talent. There is a whole compensation committee that often is staffed by board directors who, other than in their leadership roles, haven't really done anything scientific on compensation, such that, it's interesting to see how maybe some different specializations will bubble up. So, I think it really depends. And what's really important for every board is to be very thoughtful. And I think the velocity of how board directors need to know so many things about so many things, maybe every 6 months you sit down and say, okay, for the skills that we have on our board, how do those match the skills that we need in our boardroom in light of the business and where the business is going? And, constantly being aware for whatever that next incremental candidate opportunity might be, building a pipeline in those kinds of specializations.
Interesting. We know what they're focusing on to some extent. And in terms of the how important is it for a candidate to make sure they're visible to recruitment firms? How are boards using recruiters?
So I think recruiters can be very helpful. And, many boards will turn to recruitment firms to identify a pipeline of candidates or a slate of candidates. So, being known to the search community is very helpful, and making those relationships or getting those introductions, and then giving the search professionals updates on any changes in your career, et cetera, maybe getting advice, maybe having them look at your board materials to see what they think. They can be very, very helpful. And many search firms are doing, a really good job of expanding their own networks, which is good. Extraordinary women on boards will often, work with search professionals and help them to identify candidates or meet more people or whatever that might be. Building pipelines is important for boards and for search professionals. But certainly, one shouldn't limit oneself to search professionals. Some boards don't use them at all. And, I think the statistic that I heard is like 84% of board opportunities come from one's own network. So really thinking about, there's that word again, networking, really thinking about who one already knows, that knows them and is willing to vouch for them, for example, but who might be in the flow of board opportunities. So I will always tell people to take a fresh look at their network and really think about it with the lens of who do I know that is in the flow of board opportunities. And those people might be, CEOs, CFOs, founders, accountants, lawyers, bankers. They might be search professionals. They might be, folks at PE and VC firms. They might be other board directors, and really start talking with those people about their perspective on board work. And, if the timing is right for you in terms of when you're interested in pursuing board opportunities, make sure that those people know that that's something you're interested in. I think that people will often, I guess, take the view that others are mind readers, but you kind of have to activate your network and also let search professionals know what it is that you're looking for. When people don't do that, how are they expecting those opportunities to find them?
I like this idea of making it a deliberate exercise, not just to go through it in a daydreaming way, but maybe put on paper. Here's who I know. Here's that tree of people. Here's if they can be maybe a champion of mine or just a conversation. And as you said earlier, ensuring that the discussion is reciprocal. You're not going just with your hand out, as it were.
Yep, definitely. I think intentionality is important. And look, it doesn't have to be, a full-time job alongside your full-time job, but there are ways to do it with good strategic intent and consistent effort. That doesn't mean you have to meet someone who emerges from that kind of reflection, every week. You could just aim to reconnect with someone once a month or at whatever pace that you want, but every little bit counts because you never know who is going to then follow up, could be years from then, follow up and say, hey, I remember you mentioned that you were interested in board work and this opportunity happened to come along and I'd love to recommend you for it. Like, wouldn't that be amazing? And then you realize that originated in a conversation that happened 5 years before.
Right. We never know. It's like we're planting little seeds and we don't know which ones will bloom.
Exactly. Planting lots of seeds.
A minute ago, you said something about, this doesn't have to be, and I love that you're saying it's at your own pace. These sort of overachieving folks that we're all, talking about don't need 3 full-time jobs. They already probably have 2, their families, their personal commitments, their full-time operating roles and so forth. So it got me thinking about sort of 2 questions that are flip side of each other around time. If you've got a full-time role and maybe you're on a nonprofit board, we can imagine the busy people. And then on top of that, you want to start to go down this path for your board service journey. How do you think people can best aim to stay relevant, stay up to speed on what you need to be doing on top of everything else? And then the flip side of that question is, if you're already retired from your day job, kind of the same thing. How do you stay relevant? What kind of activities on both sides of that coin would you think?
Sure. I think that for somebody who is working full-time, however one defines that, you might not be allowed to serve on a board. So, make sure that you understand the rules. There could be plenty of reasons why, while you're at a job, it could be a conflict for you to serve on a board. So you don't want to start going down the path if your CEO doesn't think that that's something you should be doing, or the general counsel wouldn't approve you're doing it. So, find that out. Sometimes people encounter, a little bit of resistance or a flat out no, but sometimes there's a narrow lane in which if it's this type of company, you could serve on a board in that particular space. So sussing that out before you find yourself with a board seat opportunity would be a really good thing to do. And, I would say that by virtue of being in a role that, means that you're sitting in your company that needs to figure out how to reskill employees for AI, means that you're probably up to the minute on a lot of relevant information. That's why sometimes boards are seeking out, sitting CEOs, because they're in the flow, they're in obviously senior leadership positions, et cetera. But how many boards can a sitting CEO serve on, right? Or a sitting anyone serve on? Like maybe one. It's unusual for it to be, more than that, but sometimes that happens. It's just a question of, will you have enough time? Because one of the things that you can never predict with a board is, when you're going to run into an issue. And so I've seen situations where what looks like a pretty, functional and innocuous almost board situation suddenly becomes almost a 24/7 gig, because there's an issue that requires a special committee or something happens, and you're suddenly meeting 24/7. I mean, the pandemic did that to a lot of board directors. So your board work can sometimes really blow up and take up a lot of your time. So you kind of have to factor that in. I would say for those who are, whatever the word retirement means, we like to say leading a portfolio life and doing a lot of different things, of which board work is a part or maybe the majority of what you're doing. Staying relevant and cutting edge is incredibly important. And it gets more difficult once you've stepped away from an environment where all information would flow to you. So, in Extraordinary Women on Boards, one of the most important things we do is help our members stay cutting edge. And so we're always looking for, the best speakers on the most relevant and recent and emerging topics, because that's what board service is right now. And so if you're still in the working flow world in the more traditional sense, you have that as an advantage. That's something that until you walk away from that kind of role, you might not realize that you've gotten such a great flow of information. And then when you're on the other side of that, that really requires intentionality and effort, because you don't want to be the stale person in the room. And there are still some of those out there.
Yeah, yeah. And what we stumbled into there without even intending it is that we sort of highlighted why it's important to bear in mind that a membership in something like Extraordinary Women on Boards or NACD can be a critical piece of your portfolio lifestyle puzzle, that you're staying current and you're in the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. But that has to be an objective. That can't be like, gee, I guess osmosis will make this work. You really need to seek out proactively to learn all the time. And, the wonderful thing about this digital world we live in is that there's always something that, aside from ChatGPT, you can, get access to online. There are various programs. NACD offers quite a few. There are some offered at different, universities and such, and different certifications and all kinds of things if you're really pursuing it. And then there are all kinds of webinars and replays that are happening all the time. So, if that's a flow you want to be in, you can be in that flow.
Yeah, it is a distinctive marker of our time, isn't it? That whether you're talking about board service or something else, never a dull moment. There's always going to be a TED Talk you didn't listen to yet and that kind of thing. So staying with this theme for just a moment about the shift that one can make from day job to portfolio, we talked about a couple aspects of it. What have you noticed about what's sort of required emotionally, psychologically, to make that successful and smooth? I've noticed a lot of people do tend to struggle with it when they didn't think that would be the case.
So I feel like in Extraordinary Women on Boards, my co-founder, Lisa DiCarlo, and I are doing this unofficial research project. We are talking to so many folks who are making that transition or who have made that transition. And first of all, it can be a bit of an identity crisis. Imagine somebody asking you, what do you do? And it's a very easy answer when you were in your traditional job, right? You would say like, oh, I'm, Lisa Shallett. I'm a partner at Goldman Sachs or whatever it is. It would come very easily because you didn't realize it at the time, but you were describing yourself on the basis of where you worked and what you did. But if you step away from that, what are you? And who do you want to be? And that's an interesting thing to consider for the first time. In addition, you tend to be doing it by yourself in isolation, because for most people, if you've had a very successful career, you have focused on, your family and you focused on work. And in many instances, your relationships are kind of limited to those two spheres. And you might not, when you step away from work, have a professional peer group. So you can feel pretty isolated at a time that you're feeling somewhat insecure. And so, we've found in Extraordinary Women on Boards that feeling of community is so important. And especially for those, once they get to the boardroom, success is having a trusted, safe space and collective wisdom to tap into. So, you can navigate what it means to be an excellent director. But having that, community of peers is really important. So going back to some of the networking that we've been discussing, it's very easy to put your head down and, focus on your job, hope that you get recognized for it, but really end up in kind of a silo. And so, picking your head up and saying, how do I build relationships outside of work while you're still working? Is a great thing to do, because then once you make that transition, you end up having more of those relationships to tap into.
Lisa, so much goodness you just dropped into the conversation here. I mean, I know that you mentioned Goldman Sachs. I think you were there
20 years.
Okay. So 20 years. So that's a significant identity. So you're speaking to this from a very personal perspective.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And it happens to, I would think, most of us at some point in our careers. And I think that what you discuss about having these professional peer groups is invaluable. And you mentioned the word community. I mean, we all know that the US Surgeon General has declared an epidemic of loneliness in this country. Yes. And we haven't even touched on that matter of the remote workforce shift that's happened in the past 4 years, people moving away from their executive positions, which have been full of a significant amount of status and support, people, assistance and things flowing toward you. So it really is a great shift that has to happen, I think, internally as well as in other ways.
Right. And so, thinking about where you can find community, sometimes it's from, the schools that you attended. I've seen a number of efforts around creating, circles to connect with alums, or sometimes it might be, various organizations that are creating that kind of community outlet. And those are very valuable. Sometimes it might be around like a passion or a topic or volunteer work or whatever it might be. But that kind of connectivity is, enriches what otherwise can be, without you realizing it, kind of a two-pronged life.
Yeah. I mean, Lisa, you're the head of an organization, co-founded an organization that has women built into the title. And so it prompts me to think, have you got any opinion about whether this is an issue differently for different genders?
I've asked myself that a lot. And I think that what I can say is that something magical happens when you bring women together in community. I mean, that has been just such an incredible gift of, the very organic nature by which Extraordinary Women on Boards came to be. But for sure, just as I said before, that retirement isn't really, what does that even mean anymore? I don't see so many people retiring. I see people entering these new phases of growth that happen after the first leg or the first and a half leg of one's career. And I think that for men, that's definitely a transition too. I think there's a stereotype that somehow the guys always have a guy that finds them something to do with themselves in terms of a piece of the portfolio. And, maybe that means that it's a little bit more difficult for men to talk about this transition phase than women, but you're talking to someone who actually seeks out that conversation. So I don't know that I'm a good measure of, the degree to which that is a conversation happening out in the world.
Yes, fair. I'm with you. I'll sit in that conversation all day. So we've been on a journey in this discussion about the why, the how, the what. Let me get granular, if I may, for just a moment, because people are going to go into this next phase with a lot of information. And I also want to give them some info about the tools, the actual assets. Can you demystify for us the difference between a board resume and a board profile or bio?
Wow. Well, I will tell you that both are sources of torture for most. And I would say that if you are finding the experience of creating your board bio or resume or your LinkedIn profile, which has become just as important for being discoverable as a potential board candidate, if you find any of those are really, really hard to do yourself, then say uncle early and stop torturing yourself and find someone who is really good at those things. Because I've seen so many people really, really torture themselves over getting it right, getting it perfect, whatever that means. If you talk to most search professionals, they will tell you that they don't really bother to look at those materials. But if we're talking about the fact that your relationships are often what gets you a board opportunity, odds are that the people that you're, reconnecting with in your network or meeting for the first time, and you tell them, I'm interested in board opportunities, they'll say, oh, send me your resume or board bio, whichever that is. So you need to have it no matter what. What is the difference between the two of them? I mean, I think that maybe I'll tilt your question a little bit and say how a board bio or board resume differs from a traditional bio or resume. Because one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is to think that those things are the same. And a board bio or board resume should have the compelling skills on it about you that are absolutely relevant to board work. And I think most people tend to follow the chronological listing of everything one's ever done. Or, here's what I've done in these jobs. And, this is the same thing you'd use to look for your next job. What's really important is kind of to take the derivative of that and say, my audience is a board director, a chair of a nominating and governance committee, someone who's going to choose me for a board, someone who's going to represent me or put my name in the ring for a board. How can I make the things that I've done be relevant to what that board role is going to require? And so if you've had a big role running this business with this P&L, et cetera, you can either describe that and all the things that you did in that role, or, and preferably, say, because I had this role, here are the skills that I've developed that are relevant for the boardroom, and here's what they are. And I think if you do that, then whether it's in a bio format, which would be, written, whatever, 4 or 5 paragraphs on a page, or if it's the more detailed kind of CV version, which has, bullet points and details of different jobs. What's important is that it make a compelling case for why, because of the background you have, you therefore have these skills that would make you irresistible to have next to me in the room.
My brain was going to the word relevant, but you topped that and said irresistible, which I love. And there was some good info you shared about the heartbeat of, yes, we could talk about formats and that information will be available somewhere, but really compelling narrative about what you're going to bring to the board. Again, relevance and reciprocity. I also suspect that even through our headphones here on the podcast, we could probably hear a collective sigh in our audience's rooms where they hear your advice about say uncle early if these are torturing you.
Yeah. It's a skill to be able to write a board bio. And often we are the worst ones to write our own.
Yeah, right, right. So you don't have to do it. You can surrender that to some other expert, and there are plenty of them who do that. And I also want to just harp for a moment on the point you made, because I brought up those two documents, Board Bio and Board Resume. LinkedIn, which is what you raised in answering it, is such a critical asset. I had somebody who's a chair of a Fortune 500 board say, if you're going to mention a name to me of someone who I should consider for the board, by the time the sentence is done coming out of your mouth, I've looked them up on LinkedIn on my phone. That's where I go first.
Yep. Or maybe, when you think about due diligencing, right, which someone's totally going to do, I've Googled you, what comes up? And so part of what you could think about is taking an area of expertise that you already are in and know and are known for, figuring out how that expertise is relevant to board work, if board work is your goal, and start, posting about that kind of topic so that when somebody looks you up, they see not only your background, but also thought leadership work that you've done or expertise that you have looking through the right lens and things like that. So, there are so many ways that one can be both discoverable and take advantage of those opportunities where you can control your own narrative, such as your board bio, your board CV, or how you put your profile on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I would just underscore that last bit about posting and being seen as an expert. I think if we'd had this discussion again a few years ago, we would have discussed LinkedIn as a very one-way vehicle. I'm going to look you up and see your profile. Increasingly, it's absolutely imperative that you do put out some thought content, even if you're posting someone else's content or something from HBR, you have something to say.
Right. You can be the person who shares articles that you think are really interesting or important or have an insight and comment on it. Or you could see someone else's great comment and, add your thoughts to it. There's so many ways to do it that don't have to be such heavy lifts, as long as, what you're doing is thoughtful.
Yeah. And then you're showing the board who you are, not just what you do.
Right.
Well, we're at the end of our conversation, which I've so enjoyed. And I wanted to wrap us up by just asking, at the risk of maybe being a little bit cliche as a final question, it's going to be valuable to our listeners. What is a final piece of key advice you'd give somebody who's seeking that next board seat?
That's actually a really easy question. It is be patient. Board work sometimes can take a year or two to have work out. There are only so many seats. They only turn over so much. Processes take a while. Be patient is what I would recommend.
Amen. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom and advice. It's been really enjoyable, and I know our listeners will get a lot out of this.
Well, I really hope so. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for such great questions.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.